What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I'm going to be giving you a full walk-around look at the completed First Lite F-150 hunting truck we've been working on. Now, if you're new around here and you haven't watched the previous videos in the build series, I do recommend that you go back and check those out because they'll give you a little bit more detailed information and a look at the installs and why we chose some of the parts that we chose. But to give you kind of a quick synopsis and the idea behind this build, this truck is being built out for First Lite, who is an outdoor and hunting apparel company. They do a lot of camo gear, thermal layers, things like that, but they needed a Swiss Army knife of a truck, so to speak. Obviously, hunting rig is going to be one of the big primary purposes of this vehicle, but it's not the only thing that it's going to be doing. It also needs to haul employees and their gear around, as well as pulling First Lite's trailer and doing some serious cross-country miles. So this thing has to be comfortable on the highway. So starting off first with the front suspension, Bilstein hooked us up with a set of their 8112 front coilovers, which are obviously quite a bit larger and a lot more off-road focused than the factory struts. A couple of the things that changed here is that as a larger shock body with a Bilstein specific spring, they are adjustable for ride height in the front, and these are also external reservoir coilovers. So that whole combination of changes basically allows for a better off-road performing piece of equipment because you have a larger shock body with more fluid, and there's room for that fluid to move out of the body into the resi, which allows for the pistons to travel a bit further and gives you that increased travel. Then, of course, with the larger pistons and the increased fluid capacity, you're also going to reduce fade, and the shocks will be able to really handle longer runs on washboard trails and corrugations without heating up and losing ride quality along the way. Now, on top of all this, Bilstein uses a new technology that they call zone control in this, which basically means that there's 3 separate little pistons in there with 3 separate zones, and that allows it to be a bit more scalable and progressive in how the shock acts, so you get a good, comfortable on-road ride, but you do get some of the stiffness and the control and performance that you need in the dirt to be able to soak up those heavier hits without slamming into the bump stops or damaging the truck. Now, as I mentioned, these are also adjustable for ride height in the front. So out of the box, we ended up getting about 2.5 inches of lift in the front of this truck. But then, of course, we went ahead and added a big ranch hand front bumper to the front that weighed it down a bit. So with the ranch hand bumper on here, we ended up sitting at about 1.5 inches of lift, which is pretty much the perfect stance for this truck in my opinion, just because it levels out the front a little bit and gets it off the ground and clears some room for a bigger tire, but it leaves a bit of rake in the rear end so that it sits higher. That way when First Lite adds gear into the back of the truck or hooks up their trailer, it can settle without squatting and looking really silly as it runs down the road. Now, moving around to the back of the vehicle, we have those Bilstein 8100 rear shocks, and these feature a lot of the same benefits that the fronts have. So obviously a larger body, piggyback reservoir, bigger pistons, all that good stuff. But one of the key differences here is that the rear shocks also have adjustable dials on the outside for compression and rebound. So what this means is that First Lite can get in there, tweak these dials a little bit, and set the truck up for either towing with a lot more weight on there, kind of stiffening the rear end, or softening it up, getting a little bit more play in it and allowing for a more comfortable ride in the dirt. So it definitely has some variety in there, and you can make it work for the situation that you're in. It is also worth noting that these rear shocks don't create any additional ride height in the rear, so we left the back of the truck at stock height, which worked out just fine for this build. With all that information out of the way on the Bilstein stuff, there is actually another change we made in the rear end of the truck, and that was a 1,000-pound SumoSpring kit. And this might sound a little bit weird at first, but hear me out. This kit is basically designed to completely replace the factory bump stops with a larger bump stop that acts similar to an airbag, but obviously without a compressor or any sort of air being pumped into it. It's just a larger cushion that engages earlier that allows the truck to settle and sit on it, so that way you can reduce some of the sway and the sag that happens when you have a heavy trailer attached to the back of the truck. Now, the thing you're probably thinking is, isn't that backwards? Because now that you have a bump stop that engages earlier, you've reduced some of the travel that you gained by adding a better off-road suspension. And you are right that those do kind of counteract each other, but the beautiful thing about these SumoSpring kits and the factory bump stops on the F-150 are that they're very easy to interchange. So the factory bumps really only have 2 bolts that hold them in. You can pop them out, put the SumoSpring kit on, and it can be done in a hotel parking lot, and we actually have done it in a hotel parking lot on other builds in the past. But more realistically, First Lite will be able to decide if they know they're going to be towing with the truck for a few months or for an extended trip, then they can throw the SumoSprings on there, have it ready to go, and then when they're taking it out on hunting trips or they know they're not going to have the trailer with them, they can swap it back to the factory bumps pretty easily and gain a little bit of that additional travel in the rear end. This is just one of those little details that kind of helps round out the suspension, and like I said, helps serve a wider purpose since this truck does have to do a couple different jobs and wear a couple different hats. Moving on now from all the suspension talk, the next thing we need to cover is wheels and tires. So for this truck, we've got a set of KMC's Chase Wheels. These are a 17x9 with a 0mm offset, which is a little bit smaller than what we were running from factory. This truck naturally came with 18s on it. So with this stance, the wheel brings the tire out just a touch, so it's a bit more flush with the fender. And because it's a 17, we get a bit more sidewall on the tires, and there's room for First Lite to air down and get a comfortable ride. And I also prefer the way a 17 looks. I just generally like a ratio with a smaller wheel and a larger tire. The wheels themselves look great. This is a newer design from KMC that hasn't been out for too long, but I do appreciate the fact that it's very simplistic, and really the only thing that dresses this up is that little trim ring around the outside that's kind of a fake bead look ring. While it doesn't serve any practical purpose, it's not overdone. The gloss black looks really good on that, especially contrasted with the satin black in the center. And because the center of the wheel is such a simple spoke design, there's no extra little screw heads or machine pieces that make it look weird or really difficult to clean. So overall, it's a pretty good fit for this build, and obviously the stance that it creates works out really well too. Wrapped around these new wheels, we have a set of Falken's Wildpeak all-terrains, and these are a 285/75/17, which rounds out to about a 33.8-inch tire. Now, this size specifically is kind of more of a taller, skinnier pizza cutter tire, if you will. I wouldn't say it's quite as skinny as a lot of the classic pizza cutters, but it's definitely not as wide as a lot of the 34s and 35s that we've ran on previous builds. And the reason for that is we wanted something that had really good on-road characteristics, but didn't completely sacrifice off-road capability. With this tire being a bit taller, you get some true ground clearance and, once again, more room to air down. But it's also the type of tread pattern that isn't going to cause a lot of hassles on the road. These Wildpeaks tend to be real quiet and comfortable on the highway. They don't wear funny, and they don't create a lot of extra noise, but they still work really well in rock, sand, snow, and mud. And this is actually a tire that I run on my own personal 4Runner, and I've been really happy with it for the last couple years. So I think it's going to work well for how First Lite is using this truck. And it's one of those things that down the road, if they wear out and they want to go for a more aggressive tire, they can swap them out for something more aggressive, but it's pretty practical for the way this truck is going to be used. One of the questions that I know some of you folks are going to have is, with this wheel and tire setup on this suspension, is there any cutting or trimming that has to happen to make it work without rubbing constantly and giving it full articulation? And the simple answer is, yeah, you're going to have to cut here. And that's usually the case with these trucks. Now, we are sitting at 1.5 inches of lift, so if you were to leave the bumper off or crank it up and go to 2.5 inches, you are going to get some better clearance and it may be less of an issue. But in our case, at 1.5 inches, I did have to cut the crash bars back a little bit and do some trimming within the fender. And obviously, if you have more aggressive fender flares or you have a different size of tire, that trimming is going to vary. But just anticipate that for this exact stance, you will have to do some cutting to make it work. With all that out of the way, I think we can move on from wheels, tires, and suspension and get into some of the other aspects of the build. And I think the next thing to cover is going to be this front bumper. What we have here is Ranch Hand's Midnight front bumper and grill guard combo. And this is all steel, completely welded and powder coated. So obviously a pretty heavy duty piece of equipment, but we didn't want to skimp out. We wanted a bumper that was going to provide some real protection. And in most cases, as First Lite is just pushing into the backcountry or down some tighter forest roads or trails, this will knock a couple branches out of the way and just give them some peace of mind. But in the unfortunate event where a critter might run out in front of the truck at speed and not live to tell the tale, this is going to reduce some of that damage and hopefully protect everybody inside a little bit better. Now, there are some additional benefits that come with having a bumper like this, and one of the things I'll note is that our truck's a little more stripped down. It doesn't have front parking sensors or adaptive cruise, but this bumper is compatible with those options. So if you were planning to run this on a vehicle that's a little bit more heavily optioned, then you have that ability. Now, the other thing is that a bumper like this provides a pretty good place to mount lights. And we didn't really go crazy with the lighting on this truck, and we ended up just keeping the factory fogs down here. But in the future, if First Lite wants to upgrade or increase the light output, there's a couple different ways you can do it. So one of the first areas, like I said, would be with the fog lights. And if you remove the factory fogs, there are some slotted brackets in there that will allow you to mount a couple different pod lights, and you could set this up in any number of ways if you wanted two little rigids or Baja designs down there, but you also have the option to run a light bar in the center. Because this truck is a 3.5 liter EcoBoost V6, means it's twin turbo, so there is an intercooler hiding behind that bumper, and we didn't want to block it off with a bunch of light bars and extra equipment. Getting some good airflow through to that is going to be important, especially when First Lite is towing with this thing, but in the future they can make adjustments if they want, and I think on a naturally aspirated truck that's maybe like a 5.0 V8, it would be a pretty big benefit to have a light bar tucked in there. From here, let's move on to talking about some of the lighting that we added to this truck. And one of the kind of hidden changes that only a couple people seem to notice was that we did actually swap out the headlights, and it didn't show up in the build series, so to speak, but there was a how-to video where I popped in these XLT Special Edition headlights as opposed to just the regular factory XLT lights, and basically just cleans up the look a little bit, adds that dark gray metallic bezel on the inside, and kind of blends a little bit more cleanly with the grille that's on this truck. But moving back, we'll take a look at the rigid 360s here that we have on the pillar. As I mentioned before, we didn't go over the top with lighting on this truck, but we did want to make sure that we got a good set of ditch lights on here. So these little rigid 360s seem to serve that purpose well. These are the 4-inch version of Rigid's 360, which means that they're relatively small, and you can see even in comparison to my hand, they don't take up a lot of room, so they don't create a big blind spot on the corners of the windshield, and they're not very heavy, which means they're not going to rattle around and shake a whole lot when you're going off-road. These lights do feature Rigid's driving beam pattern lenses, which basically creates kind of a combination where you don't necessarily get a specific pinpoint spot or an extremely wide beam. It's more of a blend, so that way you get a good fill of light around the vehicle, and this is going to help First Lite to be able to look off into the woods or look into corners as they're going down trails and just kind of fill out that spread of light in the front of the truck and along the sides. With the brackets that they're on, these are Grimm Off-Road's cowl mount brackets, which just tuck in underneath that factory cowl, and they actually really only install with just one little screw on each side, so they're very simple, easy to install. You could do it in your driveway, and because of the way they're set up, you can rotate the light on the top of it and point them either further out to the sides or straight forward, depending on how you're using the lights or how you're using your truck. Another neat little feature to point out here is that these Rigids feature an amber backlight on them, which doesn't really provide any actual light output or projection, but it looks cool at night when you kick it on, ties in well with the marker lights, and I think that the orange is a nice little pop of color on this build, especially because First Lite brands a lot of their stuff with orange anyways. We've covered all of the bases for mods at the front of this truck so far, so let's work our way around to the back now and talk about a few of the things we did to the bed. When we were walking through the initial planning stages of the build, one of the things that First Lite mentioned is they really wanted to make sure we got some organization and storage in here for their gear. And while an empty pickup bed does provide a lot of utility and you can toss random totes and coolers and camping equipment in the back or whatever you need, it doesn't really work for dialing in smaller gear, and there's not a lot of protection from the elements. So the deck system seemed pretty appealing. We've actually ran these kits a few times on other builds, and First Lite really liked the look of it. So as you can see, we dropped in a deck system. This basically gives them two big drawers that they can pull out with some removable toolboxes on the inside and different dividers that can be adjusted around to basically create the right kind of storage solution for the way they want to haul their gear. And that way they can line things up that are higher priority at the front of the drawers, stuff they don't need as much toward the back. They can all be pushed away, and when you close the tailgate and lock it, there's really no way to get into them. So it also provides a bit of safety in that regard. The other important thing to note here, though, is that this deck system doesn't completely remove the ability to use the pickup truck bed like a pickup bed. Now, while we did lose a little bit of height because this vertically takes up some space, the top deck is actually capable of holding up to 2,000 pounds of weight, so you could even roll a quad on top of this and strap it down if you wanted. But what that allows is any additional gear that doesn't necessarily need to go into the deck or into the cab can go on top of it. They can strap it down as they need, and they have room to still use it like a pickup bed when they want to. The other major change we made to the bed of the truck outside of the deck system was adding in this TruXedo Low Pro tonneau. Now, this is a soft rolling tonneau, so you can basically just unlatch it at the front, roll it all the way back to the bulkhead of the bed, and it makes a nice little bundle that doesn't eat up any additional bed length, and the rails themselves on the sides are pretty slim, so you really don't lose a lot of the utility in the top side of the bed here. But the benefit is when it's rolled out and locked in position like this, it provides First Lite another area where they can tuck some gear in, like some slim totes or folded up camping chairs and tables and things like that, and get them seated in here where they're protected a bit more from the elements, and it's not going to be filling up with dust and mud and rain as stuff spills over, but it also keeps some prying eyes off of their gear as well. And people do like to point out that with a soft tonneau like this, it's just vinyl on the top, so you could take a knife, cut it open, and pull things out if you wanted, but really the purpose here isn't for security, and if First Lite has some expensive equipment that they're worried about, it's probably not just going to be sitting in here where it could be exposed or taken. They're going to have it locked away in the drawers or in the cab. But in the meantime, as they're working their way out off-road or on the road in between trips, they have somewhere to put that gear. Long story short, this tonneau cover basically is another tool in the tool belt to allow First Lite to kind of mix it up and use the bed in different ways depending on how they need to use the truck for any given day. From here, there is one final mod I want to mention that we did to the interior of the truck that doesn't really affect the bed, but it was worth mentioning, and that is the Husky Liner Weather Beater floor mats. They're just a simple toss-in mat, covers up a lot more of the carpet than the factory mats do, and because they're rubberized and they're laser fit to the actual floor pan, it's a lot of additional protection as you're moving in and out of the truck. So when you hop in there with dirty boots and you got mud and rocks and snow getting in there, it all kind of collects in that mat. You can pop it out, dump it, and the carpet underneath is protected. So we've got those in the front and the rear of the truck, so that way everybody riding along has a mat that will hold all of the crap that they drag in with them, and it should keep the interior looking a little bit cleaner over time as this truck gets used. Well, folks, that's going to bring us to the end of this build walk around. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and it gave you some ideas for your own builds, but there is one last thing that I need to mention here. If you have been watching the build series and you checked out that most recent video where we did the accessories installs on this, then you know I mentioned that there was going to be one last huge mod that was going to kind of change the look of the truck. And unfortunately, that didn't quite pull through the way that we hoped. What we were working on is a wrap design, full truck wrap with First Lite that was going to feature some of their branding and kind of a topographic pattern to really kind of complete the look of the build. And while the truck will still get wrapped, we weren't able to get it done before this video. There's a lot of delays right now. It's going to take a little bit of time before that wrap happens. Hopefully, down the road, you guys will get to see some photos and some other video with this thing complete, and you'll probably see it on First Lite's media as well. But that was what we were teasing out, and it just didn't pull through. Like I said, thank you guys for watching. We do appreciate it. Definitely leave a comment below and let us know what parts you liked or what things you would do on your own hunting build, and I will see you next time.